At 05:25 hours local time, a target suddenly appeared on the Ukrainian command screen that could change the entire course of the campaign in Crimea. The Alpha Group of the Security Service of Ukraine, the SBU, began its mission to isolate the peninsula. Following strikes on the Convoy Bridge and river crossings in Kherson, the next target was the Stavky Bridge, an important supply corridor that Russia was still using to transport fuel, weapons, and ammunition into Crimea. In the air, a Bayraktar TB2 reconnaissance UAV maintained a safe distance, using its electro-optical and thermal imaging systems to monitor the bridge. Its mission was to identify weak points, determine coordinates, and transmit targeting data back to the command center. But just as the plan was preparing to enter its final phase, the TB2 detected a Russian convoy advancing from the north. Trucks loaded with fuel, weapons, and ammunition followed one another toward the bridge, escorted by BMPT-72 tank support combat vehicles. If the convoy crossed Stavky, Russian forces in Crimea would receive critical supplies just as Ukraine's encirclement was closing in. Inside the SBU command room, the officers had only 30 seconds to choose: continue with the plan to destroy the bridge or wait for the convoy to enter and turn the entire crossing into a deadly trap. A few seconds later, the bold order was given. The Russian convoy appeared to have entered the perfect trap, but on the electronic battlefield, the observer in the sky could also become the first target. The convoy carrying fuel, weapons, and ammunition was moving slowly toward the Stavky Bridge at a speed of about 16 kilometers per hour, escorted by BMPT-72 tank support combat vehicles. If Ukraine struck at the right moment, the bridge could be blocked, while the entire supply convoy would become trapped directly on the crossing route. From a safe distance, the Bayraktar TB2 continuously transmitted electro-optical and thermal imagery back to the command center. However, each time the data link operated, it left a trace in the electromagnetic spectrum enough for Russian electronic reconnaissance stations to detect the direction of transmission. The Ukrainian strike force was now only about 6 kilometers from the target, but between them and the convoy were 3 defensive layers that had stopped dozens of UAVs during previous attacks. The TB2 was no longer simply observing the prey; its own transmission link was being hunted. Near the Stavky Bridge, Russia had deployed a Zoopark counter-battery radar. The system did not directly track UAV control signals, but monitored the trajectories of artillery shells, rockets, and missiles, rapidly determining the firing position if Ukraine used ground firepower to support the ambush. While the Zoopark protected the area against artillery, nearby electronic reconnaissance stations simultaneously measured the direction of the TB2's data link. As multiple stations combined their bearing lines, the area containing the Ukrainian control station gradually appeared on the map. From that moment, the hunt had reversed. If the control crew maintained the link from one position for too long, their coordinates could be transferred to Russian artillery within only a few minutes. The Russians did not necessarily need to shoot down the TB2 in the sky, they only needed to trace the signal and then strike directly at the control crew on the ground. There was no need to see the enemy. A signal transmitted for too long was enough for Russian artillery to turn the Ukrainian command post into a target. To avoid being located, the Ukrainian control crew continuously switched the encrypted transmission across 148 backup channels. This made it difficult for Russian electronic reconnaissance stations to maintain a bearing long enough to determine the exact source of the transmission. Data from the Bayraktar TB2 was also divided into extremely short packets. In only 0.4 seconds, the images, coordinates, and direction of movement of the convoy were transmitted, after which the transmission level was reduced to a minimum for dozens of seconds. Autopilot mode allowed the TB2 to maintain its orbit while the control crew limited its emissions. But just as the Ukrainians believed they had avoided the electronic hunting network, a new warning appeared. A Russian Orlan-10 reconnaissance UAV was approaching from the south. With its electro-optical camera and ability to transmit real-time imagery, it could scan the terrain and detect vehicles, antennas, or signs of camouflage belonging to the Ukrainian control crew. The situation immediately reversed. If the TB2 continued tracking the convoy, the control station risked being detected by the Orlan-10. But if communications were completely cut, the strike team would lose its data at the decisive moment. The Russian convoy continued advancing toward the Stavky Bridge. About 5.5 kilometers away, the ambush force was waiting for the final coordinates. Extended radio communication could expose the positions of both units. Therefore, the TB2 transmitted only one extremely short encrypted data packet containing the target coordinates, the convoy's speed, its direction of movement, wind conditions, and the optimal approach corridor. No conversation, no lengthy confirmation. Only a signal lasting less than half a second, just enough for the strike team to know where to attack. Immediately afterward, the Ukrainian control crew disappeared from the electromagnetic spectrum. The coordinates had been transmitted in silence, but to reach the convoy, the Ukrainian FPVs had to break through an electronic wall that was closing tightly around the Stavky Bridge. The final transmission burst lasted only 0.3 seconds too short for Russian electronic reconnaissance stations to determine the transmission source in time. However, the Ukrainian FPV team received sufficient coordinates, speed, direction of movement, and the optimal strike point. The Russian convoy was now crawling across the damaged road leading to the Stavky Bridge. The trucks carrying fuel, weapons, and ammunition, escorted by BMP-T-72s, had only about 11 minutes left before they passed beyond the bottleneck. The FPVs launched immediately. The target was less than 5 minutes away by flight. The first leg went smoothly. The UAVs flew close to the ground, using tree lines, embankments, and ruined structures to conceal their approach direction. But when they were about 2.5 kilometers from the convoy, bands of interference began appearing on the control screens. The image rate dropped from 60 to about 16 frames per second. The road became blurred, and the convoy ahead turned into distorted black shapes. The Russian Krasuka 4 system had been activated. Designed to disrupt enemy reconnaissance systems, radars, and radio links, the Krasuka 4 began blanketing the approach area with interference. Together with short-range jamming devices positioned on vehicles and inside fortifications, it created a layered electronic corridor more than 17 kilometers long around the bridge route. The Ukrainian operators immediately switched to a backup channel. The image returned, but weaker, more delayed, and constantly breaking up. With every second they moved closer to the target, the control link was constricted once again. The FPVs were no longer flying through an ordinary battlefield, they were racing directly into an electronic black hole. Ukraine now had only one chance. The target recognition support system had to see the convoy clearly enough to maintain a strike path toward the lead vehicle if the control link was cut. But ahead of it, the Krasuka 4 and the frontline jamming stations were tearing apart the final video frames. The screen was almost dead, but the FPV still had to fly more than 1 kilometer through the interference zone just to see the target during the final few seconds. The target locking support system operated only within a range of about 550 meters. Before it could take over, the Ukrainian FPV still had to penetrate the jamming layer created by the Krasuka 4 and the frontline electronic stations. There was no longer a stable image. The operator was forced to fly using the final data provided by the Bayraktar TB2, the convoy's position, its speed of movement, the elapsed time, and the wind direction. According to the calculations, the ammunition truck was now entering the middle section of the Stavky Bridge. The FPV descended to an altitude of about 3.5 meters, maintained a speed of nearly 68 kilometers per hour, and followed an approach direction from the 7 o'clock angle. Within the white interference, it was flying almost completely blind. Then the screen suddenly flashed. For only one frame, the bridge appeared. About 1.1 kilometers away, the Russian truck was crawling across the warped section of the bridge deck exactly where it had been predicted to be. The signal immediately disappeared, but that image was enough to confirm the flight direction. The FPV only needed to advance about another 550 meters before the recognition system could lock onto the target. The battery continued to drain. The image stuttered violently. But as the UAV approached the bridge's metal structure, the signal suddenly stabilized for more than 2 seconds, possibly because the steel beams temporarily blocked part of the jamming source. And during that brief moment, the operator saw another threat. A Russian interceptor UAV was diving from an altitude of nearly 18 meters, heading directly into the flight path of the Ukrainian FPV. The Ukrainian FPV was only a few hundred meters from the target, but before it could reach the convoy, it had to survive an aerial battle lasting only a few seconds. From the corner of the screen, a Russian interceptor FPV suddenly dived at an angle of nearly 45 degrees. It was lighter, carried no warhead, and held the altitude advantage, which meant greater speed during the dive. The Ukrainian FPV was flying low, carrying a warhead weighing about 2.4 kilograms, with its battery depleted after passing through the Krasuka 4 jamming zone. With that payload, every sharp turn consumed more of the precious power remaining. The two UAVs closed the distance at a relative speed of nearly 300 kilometers per hour. From a range of about 320 meters, a collision could occur in only 4 seconds. The Ukrainian operator immediately turned sharply to the right. The FPV banked hard, narrowly slipping away from the opponent's dive path. The Russian interceptor FPV overshot, climbed, and then circled back. It did not need to survive or return. A collision alone would be enough to make the Ukrainian mission fail. Knowing that he could not engage in a prolonged turning fight, the Ukrainian operator chose a more dangerous approach. When the opponent made its second dive from an altitude of nearly 25 meters, he suddenly cut the throttle. The Ukrainian FPV dropped from about 16 meters to just over 3 meters in less than 2 seconds. The Russian FPV flew through the position the target had just left. The Ukrainian operator increased the throttle again in short bursts. The motors regained power, the airframe shook violently, and then stabilized about 4 meters above the ground. But the maneuver had pushed the battery close to the danger threshold. The opponent continued circling behind and disappeared from the camera. No longer able to see the pursuer, the Ukrainian operator pulled the UAV's nose upward, applied maximum throttle, and climbed almost vertically. The Russian FPV immediately followed, believing that its target was trying to escape. But it was a trap. At the top of the climb, the Ukrainian FPV reduced its throttle, made a sharp 180-degree turn, and pointed its nose downward. The camera swung around and the Russian interceptor FPV appeared directly in the center of the frame, climbing from below. The two UAVs faced each other head-on. The Russian side chose to collide, but at the final second, the Ukrainian FPV slid sideways to the right, avoiding the attack path by only a few meters. The Russian FPV shot past, became disoriented inside the interference zone, and needed several more seconds to turn back. Those few seconds were all Ukraine needed. The attack FPV descended to an altitude of about 5 meters and regained its course toward the Stavky Bridge. Ahead, the ammunition truck was still crawling through the bottleneck. Behind it, the Russian interceptor FPV continued the pursuit. But in a race now measured only in seconds, falling one step behind could already be too late. The Ukrainian FPV had escaped the airborne pursuer, but directly in front of the target, another wall of fire was waiting for it on the bridge deck. The duel with the Russian interceptor FPV had lasted only about 22 seconds, but it had consumed nearly 37% of the remaining energy. The battery dropped to a dangerous threshold while the ammunition truck had passed more than 3/4 of the Stavky Bridge and was about to leave the bottleneck. At the rear of the convoy, a BMP T-72 escort vehicle suddenly turned its weapon turret toward the sound of the approaching engine. The Russian crew could not see the UAV clearly through the dust, smoke, and electronic interference, but they knew it was flying directly toward the supply convoy. The BMP T-72 was not a dedicated air defense vehicle. However, its 230mm 2A42 automatic cannons and coaxial 7.62mm PKTM machine gun could still create a deadly corridor of fire at close range. When the FPV was about 170 meters away, the two 2A42 cannons opened fire in short bursts. 30mm rounds swept across the bridge deck, blasting chunks of concrete away and forcing the UAV lower. The screen shook violently, and the target appeared and disappeared behind bands of white interference. The FPV could not turn back. It also no longer had enough battery left to evade again. The operator forced the UAV down to an altitude of less than 2 meters, skimming the guardrail and warped steel beams. The BMP T-72 continued rotating its turret, but the low firing angle was restricted by the trucks blocking the front. The PKTM immediately joined the fight, firing long bursts along the approach route. One burst grazed the UAV's airframe, making it lurch violently and forcing the controller to use the last remaining electrical power to maintain stability. The distance was now about 65 meters. The target recognition support system began detecting the tarp-covered cargo section of the ammunition truck. The target lockbox flickered continuously because of smoke, dust, and interference from the electronic stations around the bridge. A 30mm round exploded off to the left, knocking the FPV off its attack axis. The target slipped out of the center of the screen. The operator pulled the UAV back just enough to avoid flipping over, but fast enough to avoid crashing into the guardrail. The distance was now 25 meters. The battery was nearly depleted, and thrust had clearly begun to weaken. At that moment, The FPV no longer maneuvered like a complete UAV. It had only enough energy left to sustain the final dive. The BMP-T-72 continued firing, but the FPV was now too low and largely concealed from the turret's view by the convoy itself. The distance was now 10 meters. No more evasive maneuvers, no more corrections, no second chance. The FPV skimmed the bridge deck, passed through the final burst from the PKTM, and locked firmly onto the rear section of the ammunition truck. Then the transmitted screen suddenly turned white. At 05:45 hours local time, the Ukrainian FPV struck its target. Only a moment later, the Stavky Bridge became the center of an uncontrollable chain of explosions. Using the last of its remaining power, the UAV crashed into the rear of the ammunition truck at a speed of nearly 70 kilometers per hour, just as the vehicle was crossing the section of the bridge weakened by previous strikes. The warhead exploded, tearing apart the cargo compartment. Immediately afterward, the ammunition inside began detonating one after another. A column of fire more than 20 meters high erupted in the middle of the bridge deck. The shockwave knocked the truck out of its lane, throwing concrete, metal, and sections of railing in every direction. The vehicles behind it did not have enough time to brake. One logistics vehicle crashed into the burning wreckage, while the next skidded sideways and completely blocked the escape route. But Ukraine's target was not only the convoy. The bridge itself was the decisive target. The pressure from the secondary explosions caused wide cracks to spread across the bridge deck. A section of the main support beam bent downward and then collapsed, pulling the ammunition truck and large amounts of debris off the crossing. The fire quickly spread to the vehicles carrying fuel, weapons, and ammunition behind it. In just over 2 minutes, about 54 Russian military vehicles became trapped at the bottleneck, unable to move forward, unable to reverse, and without enough space to deploy their defenses. The Stavky Bridge was disabled. After the Chonhar Bridge and several crossings in Kherson were damaged, Stavky was one of the remaining important road corridors Russia used to transport supplies into Crimea. When this bridge route was cut, pressure on Russia's logistics network on the peninsula immediately increased sharply. This was no longer about destroying one truck or bringing down one bridge. It was one link in a larger campaign, isolating Crimea and weakening Russia's ability to deliver reinforcements. From a safe distance, the Bayraktar TB2 continued recording the column of smoke covering the Stavky Bridge. Below, the Russian convoy had become a mass of congestion amid collapsed concrete, burning fuel, and abandoned vehicles. Radar, the Krasuka 4, the BMP-T-72, and Russian interceptor FPVs had created multiple layers of protection around the bridge. But in the end, only one small attack UAV breaking through was enough to collapse the entire supply route within minutes. In your opinion, after the Stavky Bridge, which supply route in Crimea will become the next target? Leave your prediction in the comments.